All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Elegant Warrior podcast. After a decade-long career advising leaders in some of the largest companies in America and beyond, Dr. Gena Cox concluded that the pace of workplace inclusion change was unacceptably slow. She harnessed her organizational psychology and executive coach insights, her understanding of C-suite dynamics, and her personal workplace experiences to write a book, Leading Inclusion. Her book helps leaders connect unfamiliar dots to drive inclusion from the top of their organizations. Gena asked her clients to remember one simple idea: inclusion tops diversity. And Gena, this book, Leading Inclusion, is so fabulous. Drive change your employees can see and feel. Welcome, Dr. Gena Cox.
Oh, it's great to be here, Heather. Thank you.
It's really, when I read this book, I had to have you on because I really feel like this book applies to all of us as leaders in our own lives, in our own communities, of our own families. And it really gives a lot of insight and definitions that I don't think a lot of other of the books that I've read on this topic do. And in fact, I want to get there in just a minute, but on page 27, you give a glossary of some of the terms that we talk about. And I think that that's so important. Do you feel like we need to ensure that we are using words in the same way as we have conversations about DEI?
Well, it never hurts that we be on the same language on anything, but certainly on a complicated topic such as this. On the other hand, so I provided that glossary so that for the purposes of this book, we could certainly be on the same page. But on the other hand, I want you to know that I don't get overly obsessed with terms and words and that sort of thing if that turns out to be a barrier for people to connect, because sometimes people get overly concerned about that and they miss the opportunity to just focus on a human that's right in front of them. So I kind of try to I try to strike a balance.
Yeah.
But yeah, it does certainly help. And for example, I talk a little bit, for example, about specific words about how people describe race and ethnicity. And I did spend a little bit of time on that because I did know that some people care a great deal about the word, right? And so you might as well set yourself up for success for those people. But I kind of try to find a balance.
Yeah. And that balance is well seated, right? You've got this background, you've got your PhD in organizational psychology, you have the background as an executive coach, you are a Black woman, and you're a mother and an immigrant. And
Yeah.
so you bring all of those things to allow for, I mean, those different roles or names allow you to have a balance between those different things. Do you think that
Mhm.
that's part of what made you so uniquely qualified to write this book?
Well, I when I first thought about writing a book, I thought I was going to write a traditional business book. And that meant it was going to be full of facts, which this book does have, but it would sort of be more focused on giving people this critically evaluated information that they could then use to take action, because that's how most of us are taught to think about business books. But as I really sat down to figure out what I would write, it became evident that I needed to put myself into the book somehow. And as much as I hated doing that, I realized that I needed to, it was the stories and the anecdotes that would be the most memorable, first of all, and that would help people to imagine what something felt like. So actually, all of the experiences that you described, the identities or whatever you want to call them, then became really vivid. And I had to include them. And I think I say in the book, because I've come to sort of see this even more clearly after writing the book, that my life has been sort of like an experiment. The pre section, up until age 20 or so, and then the experiences that I've had since then. And I do tend to compare and contrast them in my own head all the time. I'm always thinking about then and now, and that perspective has been invaluable with this work, because I can kind of step back and sort of look down from above and see all the possibilities from a variety of perspectives.
Yeah. And it is, I oftentimes, when I'm working with groups or individuals, stress the ability to see those other perspectives. And it makes it a lot easier when you've lived them, right? And then
Yes,
also the
it does.
before and after. I
Yes.
think that I'd like to start with the REDI outcomes model because that
Okay.
is your model and it's the model that guides the entire book. Tell us what the REDI outcomes model is and what each
Right.
letter of that model stands for.
Well, by law, if you're going to write a business book, you got to have a model, right? That's the law, and it must have an acronym.
Right.
So check, check. But in all seriousness, I don't believe in diversity and inclusion. And what do I mean by that? The words have a meaning, and so they are real. But I don't believe in this in the sense of it a thing that you sort of define programs and initiatives for over to the side in a box. Somebody executes them, check the box, and we're done. I think of all of this work as sort of a leadership competency that sits under effective leadership. So when I thought about that and I asked executives, in the summer of 2020, what is it that seems to be holding them back from leading the conversation on this work? What they said was that, first of all, we're not sure it belongs on our plate. Secondly, people who are advising us say, maybe wait and see because you know what? You're darned if you do something and you're darned if you do nothing. So let's wait and see. And then the third thing they said was, we don't necessarily understand what it is that people who fall into these various groups that we want to help, we're not quite sure we understand what they're looking for, what they want, what success would look like. And so we have a certain awkwardness and discomfort with all of this. That wasn't a surprise to me. But then I did a survey of about 500 working people, including 149 Black women.
Mm.
And what they said was, yeah, we know that. I asked them what would they like to tell leaders, and they said we want them to be closer to us, to get to understand us. Then they can figure out what are the solutions that might be useful for us. And when they don't do it, which is what they traditionally haven't done, they just don't do it. That feels like disrespect. And as I processed that information, it occurred to me that the word respect is the most regularly used word that comes out of people's mouths when you ask them what they want, regardless of what they look like. And so the REDI, that stands for REDI, it's R for respect, E for equality, equity, D for diversity, and I for inclusion. REDI, and I call it a respect first model. And it just, I think, is a way to make it a little bit easier for people to think about what is it that people really want. Because most individuals don't say, I'm looking for diversity as my number one thing on my mind. I mean, we understand the value of it. What people are looking for is that personal experience. And so I think it's a matter of respect first.
Yeah, and I love that. I mean, I think respect is one of my highest values. I
Yes.
feel like I demand respect and I feel like I give respect in my
Mm-hmm.
relationships. And I love how you talked about respect. And I think it's interesting that you just said that people want to be understood. Do you think being understood is sort of a subset under the umbrella of respect? Is that how you would sort of look at it?
Well, what I have also come to see is that there are certain behaviors that sort of support the delivery of respect, if you would. And I think all of us want to get to the point where we sort of feel comfortable with one another, like that is really what we want. And so, what I think about is I think about what I call the three C's. I think about curiosity as an essential first step that then drives to connection. I don't think you can have connection without curiosity. And then when you have those things, then the next thing that could happen, which is really what you're striving to, is you have that comfort and ease. I think that we all wish we could have in all of our interactions. So you put all of those things together. I think if you don't have those things, it is sort of evidence that you really don't have enough interest, because the way that the word respect was used when I talked to people was all about the interest in me, the desire to understand me. So again, these all relate to one another. And then one of my friends and my colleague, Sophie Wade, who wrote a book called Empathy Works, we did a session earlier this week when we were talking about how respect and empathy are sort of they're commingled, they sort of belong together, because it is probably not very likely that you're going to be able to demonstrate respect if you are and if you aren't certainly curious. And that lack of curiosity, she thinks of it as sort of evidence that you don't have any empathy. You don't really There's no way, you don't really desire to understand. You're not, you don't have that interest at a certain level. So, these things all go together. and they drive to this respect outcome, which is the thing that people say that they can see and feel, they can tell right away.
Yeah, it's funny that you brought up the 3 C's, because it's on page 77. It says ready mindset uses curiosity, connection, and comfort to power understanding of people whose lived experiences vary from your own. And I
Mm-hmm.
loved the comfort piece, because you don't hear
Yeah.
about that a lot. And I do
Yeah.
think that as you become, I know for myself, as I become more comfortable with my friends in marginalized populations, women of color, men of color, and
Sure.
different types of populations, as I become more comfortable, I feel I can be more curious.
Yeah.
I don't feel as nervous to ask those questions.
Yes.
And then that helps me to understand the way that they live their lives and their experiences. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that it's that comfort is not stressed enough, not discussed enough. And I love that it was such a part of your book. It really was like one of those aha moments for me. And
Oh,
the
that's
respect
great.
and the respect thing was it as well. It brought up something that I wanted to ask you about, Gena, because it's something that I talk to my friends about a lot in this world. Do you think that people under that umbrella of respect, do you think that people want to be treated, we often say treat people the way you'd like to be treated,
Mm-hmm.
but do you think that we should also consider the way they'd like to be treated?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I think if you are in a business situation and as a leader, I do think you have that obligation to be thinking not just about what you want. In fact, the whole point of leadership is that you're there to support somebody else. So I think in a leadership context, I do think it is important because that's the reason why, I do think there are many leaders who are well intentioned about this kind of work and are doing things. Unfortunately, maybe they're getting bad advice about what they should do, and the reason they might be getting bad advice about what they should do is that the things that they are being encouraged to do are things that are not based on the the perspective of those who are meant to be the beneficiaries. The beneficiaries are the ones that best define what they want and how you can sort of operationalize that and implement it. Often it's this sort of one-way conversations, and so you miss the mark if you don't do that.
Well, and isn't that why you talk in the book about you have to start with the willingness to listen? And
Mm-hmm,
I think
mm-hmm.
that if we look at any skill that is the most vital in conversations about leading inclusion, it seems to me that listening is up there. Is that right?
It really is, but here's the paradox, the irony. It is a completely taboo subject. So we don't even get to the listening because right now we actually have a barrier about the communication about these things. As a society, we're really not really having conversations writ large. I think people sometimes feel like they're being forced to have these conversations and then maybe forced to listen, which is the opposite then of the naturally curious and empathetic idea that is necessary. So I do think we have to find some sort of a balance between those two ideas. But that yes, the listening, you have to be curious enough to ask or to be in situations where you might learn something new, and then you certainly have to listen when people try to share those ideas, and listen without a judgment that is only based on your own perspective.
That's right. Yeah, it's and listening without preparing a response, but just purely like I
Yeah, which
often like to
is
think of
hard.
like an open container ready to
Yeah.
be filled.
Yes.
It's especially with this conversation. You say there's a large gap between the reality of the Black experience in America and how Americans of other races perceive that reality. And I saw that throughout the book, even with the term respect. You talk about how that word has, I don't want to say additional meaning, but a certain type of meaning for Black people. And so
Mhm.
that different experience, how do you think that we as white people can best tap into and understand that so that we can be helpful as we move towards this idea of leading inclusion?
So I'm going to talk about this again from the perspective of an immigrant, and also um, I do want to qualify that I'm not a sociologist, though I have spent a lot of time studying and thinking about these issues. Here are a few things that I'll share about that. Here are my sort of observations of something that became really clear to me over time living in the United States, that Black Americans, because of the history, I think have a long tradition, and I'm including myself in this group now because I am a Black American at this point in my life, um, a strong desire to sort of be equal, right? Because that's really the thing, right? So
Yeah.
how do you prove that you're equal? Or how do you demonstrate that yourself? And how do you claim that? You have to find some way to demonstrate that in your behavior. Maybe the way you dress, maybe the car you drive, the symbols of success in America, you strive for those and you try to manifest that. But the other thing, for example, is that when Black Americans get together that I know, and people that I meet have met in my professional career, they always consistently do a few things. For example, they would always call me Dr. Cox. Now, nobody calls me Dr. Cox, and I don't ask anybody to call me Dr. Cox. But what I recognized was that that signal, that sign of achievement, was intentionally used as a way to say, I appreciate the fact that you've done this thing. It's not the most common thing. And I'm never going to let America forget that you did it and you're one of us that did it. Now, what I just said is very complicated. And it is also me going beyond the boundaries of my expertise because I'm not a sociologist, but I do know for a fact that there are very specific behaviors that then when a white person comes along and doesn't do that, people say, why aren't you giving her her title? For example, I'm using this very specific
That's
example.
it. Yeah.
And so I already automatically know that I will be in business situations. I see that play out 100 times in a year, right? I know what's going on with that. But a person who hasn't got that insight wouldn't know. It doesn't mean I'm certainly not offended, nor does it necessarily mean that the other person who's calling me doctor is offended, but they probably do take note of that difference. And depending on who you're dealing with, might say, well, why are they being disrespectful when that person doesn't mean to be? And that's when it gets really complicated. But you cannot walk around with these rules in your head, especially not in our segregated society when you don't know anything about it. But I am saying that just as an example to say to you that I do think respect has a particular power in the Black community and a particular craving for that might not always be so for people who are not in that community and maybe in other races and ethnicity groups. I'm just talking about Black people in this moment.
Yeah, it makes so much sense to me when you describe it that way. And it actually reminds me, so I do some speaking to female physicians, and they often struggle with the fact that they're not always called doctor, right?
That's
By
right.
their patients.
That's
And
right.
it's I think that it's it makes sense. The groups that have had less respect given to them want to demand it when they've earned it.
That's
And to
right.
make sure, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And again, you're right that someone might not use doctor, not out of disrespect, but just maybe not recognize or not think about it or whatever.
Right.
And to have the comfort to be able to point out that they missed the mark by not using doctor, and to have the comfort to say, explain that to me, or, I apologize. I really think that comfort piece, Gena, Dr. Cox, is a big, no,
Yeah,
no, I
but
mean,
yeah,
it's a big part of this conversation is to be
it is.
comfortable enough to look dumb.
It is. I At the beginning of the year, I set some personal goals as we are wont to do. And it wasn't until like halfway through the year that I went back and looked at a piece of paper in a journal. And at the top of my paper, I had written AAH exclamation point, because I've been sort of using that as a shorthand for the comfort, the ease, the relaxation, the breathing out, the okay, it's okay to be kind of feeling that to me is the epitome of what it feels like when people are together and connected, right? You're not looking over your shoulder, you're not doing any awkwardness, right?
Yeah.
I think it's a high bar and I know it's hard to get there, but I think that's what we're after.
Yes.
And I think it's important.
I think you're so right. I think it is what we're after. I also, for the first time today, I was listening to a podcast while I was walking the dog, and it wasn't a podcast on DEI, and yet it came up. And the woman said something DEIB. And I was like, what is DEIB? I will admit that my ignorance, I did not know. So I went home and Googled it. And it's diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And you talk about belonging in your book when you're talking about respect. What do you think about this new to me, it might not be new, but the inclusion of belonging, and what are your thoughts about that piece?
Yeah. So first of all, I wish we didn't have any of these acronyms because my nirvana would be that people would talk about effective leaders who lead all people, and they would understand that having so many labels is perpetuating sort of the silos and the boxes and all of that. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet. So we still have some acronyms, and I have one myself. So I'm part of the problem. But the reason I don't use belonging is very specific, and it isn't new. I think that terminology began to be used more often in business within the last 10 years. In fact, very specifically, there was a woman who was working for, I think she was at LinkedIn at the time. She came up with that terminology, and it resonated with a lot of people, and it began to be used. The reason that, and the reason I don't use belonging is because, first of all, it's one of those terms that people cannot really define. And if you walk up to a person and say, "Do you feel like you belong?" they might be able to answer this, but people don't say to you, I'm looking to belong." That's not the first natural thing that people say. The other thing about belonging is that it kind of supposes that there's something there that is the standard that one kind of has to fit into in order to belong.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there is, I think, from just the Black American perspective, or the perspective of anyone who is a descendant of slavery, I don't want to belong. I don't think it's the right word for us, right? All of those are reasons why I don't use it. I have nothing against the word and using it at all, but that's where it came from. And respect, on the other hand, has all of the characteristics that make it easy.
Yeah.
We know what it is. We all yearn for it. We can probably explain when we feel it and when we don't.
Yeah. I think respect makes more sense to me, especially in the
Mhm.
confines of this conversation.
Mhm.
There's been a lot of talk about belonging. I think Brene Brown has done some more recent work about belonging.
Yes.
But I think for terms of this conversation, the respect piece makes so much sense to me. The example that you've given allows me to see it differently, and
Mhm.
therefore be very conscious of giving respect every time that I'm in a situation like the one that you've described. Whereas,
Yeah.
how do I make them feel like they belong is a little bit more ephemeral, and so I
It
think you're right
is.
about that.
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, the one thing I will say about what you just said, I want us all to get to the point where we're not going around thinking that we have to have a checklist in our heads
Mm.
about what we ought to be doing in order to be effective in dealing with one another. Mind you, now, there are so many things I wrote in my book specifically for the purpose of educating, because I know in our society we're so segregated, there's no way that you would know some of these things. So I do think that there's an opportunity for all of us to learn things, but I also don't know that people need to be walking around thinking, "Oh my gosh, did I just do that? Oh my gosh, should I?" That's the part that
Yeah.
I think I got to help people figure out, how do we get through that to get to the other side.
Yeah, I agree with you, because you can't have any connections or comfort if you're constantly going, wait, did I say something wrong? And is that,
Yes,
yeah, yeah.
yes,
And that's the hard part, right? Because if you come from a good place, you don't want to hurt you don't want to disrespect, you don't want to hurt other
yeah,
people, you
yeah,
don't
yeah,
want to feel like you're not being inclusive. And so, yes, finding that balance between having those things come naturally, it will happen as more people read the book, as more people become aware of some of these words and these experiences and why it matters, and the perspective of the other, whoever the
yes.
other might be. I think that things will improve. I can't believe how much our time together has flown by. Before I ask you those final three questions, though, I wanted to ask you, because I was recently on a panel, a DEI panel. I was there as a woman, I guess. But one of the men who presented, um, he was talking about measuring, and it was an interesting thing to me. He was talking about measuring results in this space. And do you have a sense of that? Like, what, if we want to aim for a result, what is that result that can show
Mhm.
us that we're doing well in this
Yeah,
space?
absolutely. My background is in measurement, and there are different kinds of measurement that would be relevant. Because, first of all, these concepts are not identical. So I said inclusion tops diversity. So are you measuring an outcome for diversity? If you're measuring a diversity outcome, which is the easiest thing to do, you're measuring, representation. the proportion of people in whatever that target group is relative to their availability to the general population, and that's measurable. If you're talking about the inclusion piece of this, it gets a whole wide spectrum of things that one could measure, starting, of course, with the day-to-day experience of of a person and of a group, which you measure typically in surveys and focus groups and that sort of thing. And it's more getting at feelings. You could include a question about respect and follow-up questions. You can measure all of those by asking people about their experiences. But the other aspect of this whole inclusion and respecting thing is that people, and the subtext of my book, drive change that people can see and feel, is that the other way to think about this is that the respect is manifested in being seen, heard, and valued. Seen, heard, and valued. So you can measure the evidence of being seen, heard, and valued. Seen has to do with, sort of being allowed to sort of be in positions where, and opportunities where you're visible, where people sort of recognize you, don't feel like you're hidden away in the basement or something like that. Being heard is all about the expression of ideas, being able to express your point of view, having the organization maybe use your ideas in meaningful ways and not suppress your ideas and all of your talents and so on. Those are examples. And then on the valued side, there's a lot of focus, especially this year, on pay equity, promotion, career mobility, and recognition. Do you get recognition and feedback of the kind that you need so that you can develop and grow, and so that you feel like when you do something good, it's not ignored, right? And those are just examples. And all of those things can be measured.
Yeah, that's fabulous. And it's the best answer that I've heard to that question in a very long time. So
okay.
That's wonderful. Gena, as I said, our time together has flown, and we will put a link to your beautiful book in the show notes, Leading Inclusion.
Thank you.
Drive change your employees can see and feel. But guys, listeners, this is not just for leaders in a CEO or the C-suite. This is for anyone who leads their family, who leads themselves, who leads and wants to lead in their community. This book, and the respect portion of this book, is a new way to look at this topic, and it's a way that is well worth exploring for everyone who is listening and watching this. Now, as we wrap up, Gena, I always ask the same final 3 questions. The first question is about elegance. The root of the word elegance is to choose, and we believe that you choose your elegance. What does that word mean to you?
I thought about this. No one had ever asked me this before. And when I think about elegance, I think about Iris Apfel. Do you know who she is?
Yes, I know exactly who she is.
I know a lot about her. That's another story for another time. But elegance, then, to me, really represents knowing yourself well enough that the ideas and the physical things that you've put out into the world as your symbols of who you are so aligned are so authentic with you, that everybody gets it, and they have an element of this whole sort of ease. They have an element of not complicated. I didn't want the word sophisticated. It wasn't in there for me. It has just the ease. Everything sort of fits together as it should.
I love that. Ease, authenticity. It's like a
Yeah.
great combination. I love that definition. Next question is your answer to this question will be added to our show notes as well. What book other than your own would you recommend for my listeners and watchers?
Well, I have to recommend a book called Unapologetically Ambitious. The author is Shelley Archambault. She was the first Black CEO of a Silicon Valley tech company, which is the only reason that I knew her name, because I had always been watching her. But then she wrote this amazing book that everybody will benefit from, because it's all about how she set goals for her career and how any of us can do that too. So I highly recommend that book to your listeners.
I read the book, and I also started following her on Instagram, and she makes a brunch on the weekends, and she posts pictures of her brunching, and I'm like, she's worth the follow just for the brunching. But the book is fabulous. I'm a member of the Next Big Idea book club, which is a fabulous book club, and it was one of their book club picks as well.
Yes.
Highly recommend. I will put a link to that in the show notes. And then the last question is my favorite question, and the answer to this question will join our Spotify Elegant Warrior playlist. What is your theme song, Gena? I know you do a lot of speaking, whether it's while you're taking stage or taking the stage in your own life. What song is playing in the background?
Well, the way that I wanted to answer this song was more about the song that just makes me happy. And I don't always use this as like an entrance to a talk, but it's 21st of September by Earth, Wind and Fire. I was
Oh,
like,
I
all of a
love it.
sudden
Yeah.
I
Oh,
can
I
read.
love.
And this is a soundtrack of a certain era of time when I was, a young adult. But it just makes me profoundly happy. And that is, I think that whenever I play that, I think, you can impact the world just by the vibes you put out. And that's why I love that song.
I love that. And I do love the idea that the vibes that you put out can have an
Yeah.
impact. And I
Yeah.
do think that, truly your book will empower me to give more respect, more intentionally and deliberately. And I love that. I love when a book changes the way that you put out your vibes.
Oh,
So thank
good,
you for
good.
this book and thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Heather. Thank you for having me.